Okay, I'm struggling. I've been struggling with 4 days of not quite a shutdown, almost an autistic shutdown. Certainly withdrawal, anxiety, and a bit of an existential feeling of dread. Of course, I've done a little bit of masking so I could get by with the commitments that I already had before retreating back to my bed. And all of this was thanks to one meeting. And of course, I can't help thinking that this is a massive fault in my system. And while there are absolutely several faults within me, the real fault was not in my system, rather in the system that was the culture of an organisation and some thinly veiled misogynistic comments from an individual. How is this still happening in 2025? So all of this got me thinking, what happens when autism and sexism collide? And is there anything we can do about it? Okay, let's start with the context. Are you ready for some story time? I'm looking to engage in a collaborative project with an organisation. It's funded by an external body, and the project is all centred around the individual, i.e. me. So I'm actually talking to several organisations about whether or not we can make this project work. So I engaged with a team that knows me pretty well, knows my capabilities, has worked with me several times in the past. So I thought it would be a good one to work with because I've already proven myself in that environment. We had to pull one additional person, a kind of middle manager kind of person, into this meeting. And that person just happens to be in a gatekeeping role in the department that I'm looking to potentially engage with. In my mind, this call was about identifying the challenges that they currently have and figuring out how we can address those challenges. I guess in their mind, the call was about me feeling like a piece of who has no value to offer, despite the fact I've actually been doing this work for 20 years now. The types of comments I got were, well, we'd really need somebody who the senior people would respect. You don't even know me, you don't know my work. What you do know of my work, or should know of the work, what I've told you about my work, is that it mostly involves engaging with senior people. They also told me how, they'd just been talking to people who have come from a big business, a well-known business, and that label would be much more helpful, apparently, to garner respect. Despite the fact that this project's actually about entrepreneurship, not about working in a corporate. Bear in mind, this was not a job interview. This person doesn't get to decide who gets this funding, but unfortunately he does get to gatekeep some of the interactions I would need to start moving this project forward. I had no idea this was an audition. It was meant to be an exploration. It also isn't a competitive process within this organisation. When he brought up other people, he was starting to compare me to other people who might do this better than me. Well, great. Put those people forward then, and let's see if this well-renowned funder funds them or funds me. It's not your choice. And in fact, my application wouldn't even stand in the way of somebody else's application. That is, unless I'm a better candidate and there's only a certain amount of money to go around. Are you afraid that my project might deem to be superior than those who you see as fitting the mold better? Look, I also accept I might not have the network and skills required to solve the very specific challenges of this organisation. But how about we get to those challenges first? It would have been really useful to understand where your problems lay prior to you putting me on the spot and demanding that I tell you how I'm the best person to solve these unidentified challenges, and then proceeding to tell me all the reasons why you don't value the things that I might bring to the table. Now, there were colleagues in this meeting that know me very well, and they actually advocated for me in this meeting. They were a good support. And together we did our best to explain how doing the same things as they've always done wasn't going to actually solve the problems which were eventually identified in the last 10 minutes of this phone call. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that this is also an organisation where I have experienced SA, SH, bullying, gaslighting, and even fraudulent collaborators. Why am I going back for more? I've asked myself that, and we'll get onto that in a minute. I came out of this call in shock. My colleague said to me, "I'm so sorry you just had to go through that. I wasn't expecting it to be that kind of cool." Me neither. That's not what we'd written in the pre-meeting notes. Look, I wish I could say that's no big deal, and this is just the nature of work, and we've just gotta pull our socks up and get on with it. But it was a big deal. It completely floored me. As an autistic person with an autoimmune condition, I am very, very protective over my energy. I have a relatively short amount of time to pull this project together, and I'm constantly nervous that another flare-up or another burnout is going to come along and reduce the amount of time that I have to actually get things done. And now I've got the added uncertainty of, should I go with this organisation? Should I find another organisation to go with? And I do have another one in mind. I'm just not certain if I want to keep jumping through these hoops in an organisation that is showing me that it is still built on patriarchal power. My anxiety has been through the roof. I'm beating myself up about this situation. I keep thinking of all the things I could have done differently, all the things that would have changed it. But the reality is, did it matter what t-shirt I was wearing? Did it matter whether I was too friendly on the call? If you want me, you get my personality. I guess you just don't want me. So I thought it was about time I dived back into thinking about the intersection of sexism and ableism, and especially for those of us with invisible disabilities. I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Becky, and for many years I've been involved in the conversations about the challenges faced by women at work and the challenges faced by autistic people at work. I also recognise that there are other intersectionalities that I don't experience that would have an even bigger impact on people in these organisations. So we're talking about the overlap between challenges faced by autistic people and challenges faced by women. But intersectionality isn't as simple as just looking at a Venn diagram and where these two areas overlap. When two things collide, or multiple things collide, we not only get an amplification of challenges, but we also get different challenges. I previously made a video on the 10 ways in which autism shows up at work for women. I won't go back into all the details that were in that video, you can go back and watch it. But one of the key points is that autism is often misdiagnosed in women, not diagnosed at all. And that means that often what we see in women with autism is actually the kind of consequences of covering up that autism or not being aware of that autism, rather than some of the more traditional autistic traits. So I am going to go through just that very quick list of 10 things without any detail, just so you get a sense of what shows up for me, but is also research backed and other people experience these things too. So there's irregular working patterns and maybe an inability to be in a kind of traditional corporate 9 to 5. Mirroring and masking. So rather than maybe seeing lots of stimming or inappropriate behavior or withdrawal in the workplace, you're more likely to see mirroring and masking going on, which of course is invisible to many people. Related to that is a lot of burnouts, patterns of burnouts over many, many years. Confusion about identity is something that goes on a lot and it's something that we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. Discomfort at game playing is number 5. I wish I could just play the game sometimes. Or do I? I don't know. Frustration that others can't see things in the same way that you can. For me, I'm a big systems thinker. I don't look at things through very narrow, kind of myopic lenses. And often that means that it can be very frustrating to talk to people who look at things in a very blinkered way. Number 7 was the spiky skill set. So especially when it comes to certain social things, we might be incredibly capable at many, many areas, but there are certain things where suddenly we are very challenged. Number 8, obsessions with certain projects, just getting really obsessed and maybe hyper-focusing around them, or like not being able to let go of certain things. Number 9 is consistently finding yourselves in vulnerable or toxic situations. And number 10 is a constant feeling that you don't fit in. I also want to take the chance here just to show this graphic by Dr. Megan Anna Neff, which shows some of the broader, not just workplace, challenges that are faced by women with autism. So how do all these things, which actually sound quite big, kind of macro things, relate to these small situations, or seemingly small situations, that we might find ourselves in? If you've experienced anything that you have heard from me already in this video, then you may have been experiencing misogyny. Yes, not misogyny, misogyny. I know, it sounds the same. This is a term that was coined by Julia Mayer on Substack, and it is coined to describe the relationship between misogyny and autism. Julia actually says it's meant to sound the same as misogyny, to indicate the invisibility of many of the things that we go through as autistic women. She says, we can talk about the specific struggles of autistic people and we can talk separately about the struggles of women, but the combination of the two is a unique experience that deserves its own term. Of course, this term is applied much more widely than just workplace experiences, but the way Julia describes it is that perfect interplay between how an autistic woman has to navigate challenges associated with gender and challenges associated with their autism. The crux of this interplay is identity. And the way I see it is my identity as a woman is a very external one. In fact, it's something I don't really identify with that strongly internally. There's a lot of gender norms I don't comply with. However, I'm obviously perceived as a woman on the outside, so therefore gender biases apply. And I've also been conditioned to behave in certain ways because of social expectations of women. My identity as an autistic person, on the other hand, feels very ingrained, very internal to me. And perhaps because of my gender, I have learned that I must hide my autistic identity. I mean, I wasn't even diagnosed until just over 2 years ago, so I wasn't even really aware for a long time that that was something that I was hiding. I was just making sure that I showed up in ways that was palatable. And that's not a conscious thing, that's just something that you are conditioned to do over time, because if you don't, then there are consequences, and they're not very pleasant. So most people I know love actually that I can bring an autistic label to the party. In fact, they salivate over that because it ticks a bunch of diversity boxes. But it is well known that women are more likely to mask in the workplace. So they either withdraw completely or cover up what is going on and focus more on people pleasing. We do this because we don't want to risk making others feel uncomfortable. Again, this is all subconscious because it sounds so dumb when you say it out loud. And yet it's not dumb. And if you're doing that, it's not dumb. It absolutely makes loads of sense because people can't cope with that discomfort. You need to do that in order to be able to have opportunities out there in the world. The lesser known partner to the mask is the mirror. And actually, this has become my tool of choice, and it doesn't really serve me all that well. And it certainly hasn't helped me when it comes to understanding my own identity. Because how can I be clear around my own identity if actually a lot of what I'm doing is mirroring back what I see from others? I'm mirroring their own biases against me. I'm mirroring their behaviors. I'm mirroring their passions, their joy, their thoughts, their opinions. So I've spent a lot of time having to create space for myself outside of the workplace just so I can reconnect back with my own identity. On the whole, my ability to be a chameleon in the workplace has served me incredibly well. On the outside, but on the inside, it's just making things harder. So when somebody who I've never met, who I don't know, I don't understand their motivations, their needs, when they put me on the spot and ask me about my identity and ask me who I am, when I haven't rehearsed that answer for that specific audience, my anxiety goes through the roof. I go into fight or flight, which for me actually manifests more as freeze and please. So just as for me, my gender is more about external perception and my autism is more about internal feelings, the negative impacts also play out in that way. So the negative impacts of my gender are actually in other people's biases. It's outside of me. They come from the outside and they infect others around me, which then has an impact on my opportunities. Whereas the autistic tendencies that I have, the impacts are much more on the inside. They impact me through the way I feel, the way I respond, but others may not ever even see those things. And they probably will never understand why certain things hit so hard. So much of the research that I've found on this focuses on the discrimination that autistic people face on the outside if they don't mask. And I have to say, I am very grateful that I have the ability to mask, because the bullying and the prejudice against those who don't is horrendous. They are explicitly ostracized. However, for me and other high masking individuals, it is the burnout, it is the anxiety that causes us to be ostracized. So when it comes to other people's perceptions of me, I can be very confusing. I'm judged by many of the biases that people are going to judge women by, even though I actually go against a lot of gender norms. And this is the case for many autistic women. And my masking makes people misinterpret the needs that I might have, especially as it pertains to social or communication needs. For example, I'm much better if I'm prepared than if I'm put on the spot. Yet another example of how centering neurodivergent needs would actually be better for everybody who was on that call. I'm also not very good at towing the party line. Now, one of the things that is said in the research is that autistic femininity is deviant. I kind of like that mischievous word, to be honest. At least it doesn't feel so weak and vulnerable as so many of the other words feel. But my refusal to play the corporate game puts me at a disadvantage. Look, the only way I know how to work is to look at the impacts that we want to create and work together to come up with the best ways to solve those challenges. If I'm put on the spot to prove myself based on my CV, something which I can't actually change, when somebody has already judged me to be less than, I just can't. I don't know how to play that game. So my biggest challenges are related to power differentials. And I read this really interesting article by Morgan et al. Called The Intersection of Autism and Gender in the Negotiation of Identity. It covers many aspects of intersectionality and gender, and it's not just focused on workplace dynamics. But I was particularly interested in reading about the vulnerability narrative. Femininity is still deemed to be passive or submissive, especially in patriarchal power systems. When this is combined with autism, which is defined by deficits, it leaves someone feeling particularly powerless. I've seen it described as infantile. And I've mentioned before that I often feel like a child in the workplace. And boy, did this interaction remind me of that. Now, if you feel like a child, and you're trying to live up to somebody who is standing in the way of you achieving your goal or your desired impact, your ability to back yourself drops significantly. For me, I don't fight, I withdraw because I feel so vulnerable in those situations. So you find yourself doubting yourself a lot. And I find myself personally gaslighting myself. Oh, they didn't say anything that was specifically related to your gender. Oh, this isn't about your autism. The reason you don't get respect is because you're just not good enough. Maybe they just would have said this to everyone. It's not their fault that you're too weak because you're chronically ill and autistic. I gotta tell you, the inside of my head speaks quite a lot like the alt-right on Twitter. So going back to the article, it explains that the narrative of female autistic vulnerability, which synthesized the trope of feminine passivity with discourses of autistic deficit and disability, naturalized and obscured the operation of patriarchal power. Yes, I know. It's quite a mouthful. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So essentially, there is a vulnerability associated with being female and autistic, as I've already described. And then because we've been living with this for decades, it's actually backed up by many, many experiences over the years. For me personally, I have been vulnerable. I've been vulnerable to physical harm, but we shouldn't underplay types of harm I have experienced more frequently, which are financial and emotional harm. So for example, in that meeting, did I ever feel like that person was going to physically harm me? Well, we were on a Zoom call, so no, and I honestly would think no, that's never going to happen. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh about something so serious. But do I feel that due to my identity and not due to my capabilities, that this person can stop me from getting work? They can also make me feel less confident in my own work, which is then a slippery slope. Can they stop me from getting work opportunities? Yes, absolutely, because it's happened many times before. And it's not just the behavior itself, it is the emotional impact of that behavior. Because I've had years and years and years of experiencing this kind of thing, I recognize that I carry a lot of emotional baggage, which means that my ability to just pick myself up and dust myself off is impinged. Therefore, my ability to actually find the time and the energy to work on the proposal is also impinged. Anyway, back to the article. Let's look at the second part of this. So this idea that there is a narrative of female autistic vulnerability. This is naturalized and obscured by the operation of patriarchal power. So, like I said, I didn't fully understand this initially. I've had to look it up. So naturalized is essentially something being normal or inevitable. So we are inevitably vulnerable if we are in a patriarchal system. That vulnerability doesn't necessarily exist if we're in a system where everyone wants to come together and collaborate to make the work better. And in these kind of systems of power, of course it is normal. Like, it doesn't feel abnormal for somebody to ask you about your background in a meeting if they've never met you before. Like, what has that got to do with my gender? It doesn't necessarily. They could easily be argued to be normal questions. And the questions itself isn't necessarily something that I had a problem with, I should say, in this meeting. Because why wouldn't you do your due diligence around somebody that you might work with? I certainly have, although I've based it more on somebody's behaviour rather than on their CV. So let's move on to this idea of the obscured part of that sentence. This is about hiding the patriarchal power in plain sight. It wasn't asking the questions that was the problem. It was throwing those grenades that attacked what I was bringing to the party. It's the way male-dominated power structures work. To tell me that based on my background, I wouldn't be respected by senior people, when the majority of my career for the last 20 years, which has included winning some pretty high-powered awards, has involved engaging with senior people. Who is this person to say that? To pick out some things that I clearly don't have and use that as a way to disempower what I could bring, and to say that out loud several times in a meeting, is just mean. It's not helpful in any way to anyone. And I don't really understand why we're creating space for that. And let's not forget, this was not a pitch or an interview. This was an internal meeting designed to focus on the challenges faced by the organisation. I just think about what I would do in a meeting, and I would never, ever do that. Not only because I'd want that person to feel comfortable and safe, but because if you make them feel comfortable and safe, you're going to get the best out of them, and ultimately, and this is the crux of this whole thing, my decision is whether I'm going to go for this award so that money goes into this organisation or money goes into a different organisation. That's my choice. Anyway, it's a well-documented phenomenon that women get asked prevention questions in the workplace, while men are more likely to get asked promotion questions in the workplace. And this is actually a prime example, although I didn't even get asked questions, I just had statements hurled at me about who I am and what I can do by somebody who doesn't know me. So promotion questions are all about the vision. A lot of the things I've been alluding to here, how are we going to work together to make the positive impact that we want to make? Some might say I was naive to prepare the answers to these kind of questions when I came into this meeting, but that's the way I work, and why shouldn't it be? Prevention questions or statements, on the other hand, are all about the barriers. For example, well, how will you ensure that things don't go wrong? How will you ensure that these senior people will actually respect you? I just can't imagine a man in their 50s being asked that question. Like I said, I wasn't even given the courtesy to respond to that question because it wasn't even posed as a question. And if it had been asked as a question, I actually probably could have answered it. So the way that sexism shows up in everyday life, in an everyday workplace, is so embedded into some of these institutions that people don't even notice them and they don't even question them. I didn't question it in the moment. Basically, the game is rigged, and it's so well rigged that people don't even realize that it is a game. They just call it reality. I think one of the reasons this all took me by surprise is because over the last few years, I haven't experienced this kind of thing. And that's for several reasons. One is because I've become more well known in my field. I've been more respected. I am more experienced, and I know how to actually make positive change, and I'm pretty confident in that. I've also had more choice over who I work with, and so I have kept myself away from these kind of organizations, those that are still built on patriarchal power structures. But then the other thing I've done is opt out of the corporate world and opt out of engaging with organizations because, quite frankly, they scare me because of all the baggage that I carry with me. I know I'm not good at dealing with these kind of situations. And in the past, I was a lot more vulnerable than I am now. But this took me right back to situations that have burned me over and over again. Situations that have left me shut down, burnt out, and crying behind my sofa whenever I get home from work. They've also left me with financial instability. So we have to remember that this is not an isolated incident. It's built on the back of a whole career, a whole lifetime of going through these things, littered by boulders that have been rolled into my path by people who are already in a secure position, people who could benefit from having me alongside them, but people who, instead of building me up, are so indoctrinated by the power games that they probably don't even realize the amount of distress they're causing someone. And all the while, I can't help thinking as I record this, what's the big deal? People are in far worse off positions than you are. Just get over it. And that's what internalized oppression looks like. So what do I do now? Do I move forward with this organization? Part of the anxiety I've been suffering over the last few days is because it took something from what was seemingly quite simple and threw a whole bunch of questions and barriers in, which I just don't have the spare energy or time to answer. Very common for people who are neurodivergent or people who are suffering with autoimmune conditions to know what the right thing is to do, to know how to tackle situations, but to just not have the energy left to do that. Because we're already walking such a tightrope with our energy levels. I just about have enough energy to get through a normal day, a normal week. But then there is nothing left. I make plans months in advance because I have to manage my energy so carefully. And I built contingency into this project. I built normal project contingency. I built contingency because I know it needs sign off by a bureaucratic organization. I built contingency because I might experience a burnout or a flare-up. I built contingency because it's the summer and people might be away. I forgot that I would need to build a misogyny-induced shutdown into my contingency too. And that's not to say that there won't be further traps that are going to be laid out in front of me before I can make anything happen here. You know the movie Labyrinth with David Bowie? Do you know that movie? I actually feel like I'm walking through that labyrinth when the only thing I had the energy to do was open up my laptop and get working. I'm left questioning if I should pivot to another organization or keep fighting to get my values seen within this organization. And that alone is more emotional baggage. And as I think about this, I keep thinking I must be so dumb to give this person more of my power. But I also can't help thinking that change will never happen if I don't fight it. The part I haven't shared with you yet is almost laughable. As we got close to the end of this call, we started to get to where I hoped we'd be right at the beginning, which is focusing on the actual problems that they had. One of the problems? Diversity. Now, based on my own experiences with this particular organisation, I actually am not surprised about that. And you're probably not that surprised about it either, now you've heard some of this. But I still need to ask myself questions. Am I too vulnerable to fight this fight right now? Can I rise above and keep moving forward? Or would working with this organisation be going against my principles? Surely they don't deserve my time, my energy, and the money that comes with this. Will it just bite me in the butt? Like, I must have learnt my lesson by now about working in this place. Or is this an invitation to step up and start making things better for others? And that's my motivation. A friend said to me this week that I need to make sure that I'm looking after myself first, putting my own oxygen mask on. But does that mean walking away from this difficult situation or walking towards it with the tools that I have to make a difference? What would you do? When autism and sexism collide in the workplace, it doesn't impact your intellect, it impacts your nervous system, which screws with your schedule. So unfortunately, an additional pause is required to take stock and recover. I've had to do a lot of processing around this situation, but it didn't just derail my week, it reminded me that change is still required. And that change isn't going to happen if I just walk away. I've spent years masking, trying to play the game, trying to be palatable, silencing my voice. And yet in one meeting, one moment of power imbalance, I was right back to doubting everything. Despite the fact that it's been a difficult few days, I am using this moment as another data point. My reaction to it isn't weakness, it's my reality. And it's the cost of surviving and attempting to thrive in a system that is built on flawed principles. Now I'm more certain than ever that change is required. So what are my power moves here? Firstly, finding my allies, of which I have plenty, and it turns out I'm not the only one that feels this way about this particular individual. I'm also working on a plan A and a plan B in this situation. This isn't the only organisation I have the potential to work with here. I'm also not going to show them all my cards. This organisation has to rebuild my trust. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask questions that are required to build a good project. And if they can't answer them, I'll have to go elsewhere. And the final thing I'm doing is making a YouTube video about it. So let me know if this is helpful, because my goal here is to make others feel less alone if they are going through similar things. And if you're not ready for any of that yet, if you find yourself in a similar situation, I hope that you can just have grace for yourself. So many of us carry these stories of the gatekeepers who don't actually see us, of meetings that derail our energy. If you're feeling this, you're not alone. And I hope that by sharing my story, you can see that it's not all in your head. Even if you can't perfectly explain the ways that you were made to feel less than. Because that's how I feel. I feel I haven't been able to perfectly explain this here. But that doesn't mean it is all in your head. It's actually in the culture. And we have to keep saying this out loud together. If you have stories that you want to tell, I'm ready to hear them. So please do pop them in the comments or reach out to me. Thank you so much for watching today. And hopefully I will see you with something a little more upbeat the next time we meet. I'll see you soon. Bye.